We've thought about this carefully, and you're making a mistake. The wedding is cancelled. You'll thank us later. I stared at my phone screen in the elegant consultation room at Meridian Grand, surrounded by fabric swatches and floral arrangements, watching my mother's text appear in the family group chat like a bomb dropped into still water. My hands started shaking. This couldn't be real. 3 weeks before my wedding, my mother had just announced to our entire family that she was canceling my wedding for my own good. Before I could process what I was reading, the responses started flooding in. My sister Amanda. Mom's right, Claire. We're all worried about you. Aunt Carol. Someone needs to say it, this is too fast. Uncle Tim. We love you, sweetie, but maybe you should reconsider. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My wedding planner Jessica looked up from the centerpiece mock-ups we'd been reviewing, saw my face, and immediately came around the table. Claire, what's wrong? I couldn't speak. I just handed her my phone and watched her eyes widen as she scrolled through the messages that kept coming. Each family member adding their agreement to my mother's declaration, building a wall of judgment that felt insurmountable. Oh my God, Jessica whispered. Can they actually do this? I found my voice, though it came out hollow. They think they can. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I owned this venue. I owned Meridian Grand and 4 other event properties through my company, Meridian Events Hospitality. I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar business, but to my family, I had always been the problem child, the difficult one, the daughter who couldn't measure up to my perfect older sister Amanda. Amanda, with her corporate job and her sensible sedan and her conventional life choices. Amanda, who made $67,000 a year as a middle manager and was treated like she'd conquered the world, while I built an empire and was patted on the head like I was playing pretend. My phone rang. David, my fiancé of 4 years, the man I was supposed to marry in exactly 21 days, the architect who had supported every dream I'd ever chased. Claire, what the hell is happening? Your mom just called me saying the wedding is off. His voice was tight with confusion and anger. Did you see the group chat? I asked, my voice breaking. I'm looking at it now. This is insane. They can't just cancel our wedding. But they thought they could. And that was the devastating part. 150 guests had been invited. The invitations had gone out 2 months ago. Deposits were paid, flights were booked, hotel rooms were reserved. And my family had decided, without consulting me, without even talking to me first, that I wasn't mature enough, wasn't stable enough, wasn't ready enough to get married. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click. But for me, it means a lot. Hatch. Part 2. The pattern had started so early, I couldn't remember a time when it hadn't existed. This invisible hierarchy, where Amanda occupied the position of golden child, and I was cast as the problem who needed constant correction and concern. Amanda had been the straight A student, the one who brought home perfect report cards that got framed and displayed on the mantle, while my B+s in creative subjects were met with worried conversations about my lack of focus and questions about whether I was applying myself. She had been captain of the debate team, president of student council, recipient of the Citizenship Award 3 years running, and every achievement was celebrated with family dinners and phone calls to relatives and posts on my mother's Facebook page with captions like, "So proud of our Amanda." I had been the kid who asked too many questions, who colored outside the lines, who wanted to rearrange the furniture in my bedroom every few months, and got labeled as unstable for it. When Amanda got accepted to State University with a partial scholarship, my parents threw her a graduation party with 50 guests and a cake decorated with the university's logo. When I got accepted to the same university 2 years later with a full academic scholarship, my mother said, "That's wonderful, dear," and reminded me that Amanda had graduated cum laude, and I should try to follow her example. The business degree I earned, magna cum laude with a concentration in hospitality management, happened on a Saturday, that conflicted with Amanda's company picnic, so my family arrived an hour late to my graduation ceremony and left immediately after to make Amanda's event, and I stood in my cap and gown taking photos with friends whose families had stayed for the reception, trying not to cry. I had started Meridian Events Hospitality at 24, just 2 years out of college. With money I'd saved working 3 jobs during school and a small business loan I qualified for, based on a detailed business plan I'd spent 6 months perfecting. My first client was a small corporate retreat that paid me $3,000, and I'd been so proud I called my mother immediately to tell her, and she'd said, "That's nice, Claire. Did you hear Amanda got a promotion? She's making $52,000 now." By the time I was 27, 3 years ago, I had built my company to 7 figures in annual revenue, owned 2 venue properties, and had consulting contracts with 3 major hotel chains in the region. I had purchased Meridian Grand, the crown jewel of my portfolio, for $1.8 million and spent another $300,000 renovating it into the stunning historic mansion venue that now hosted over 80 weddings and events per year. My business employed 47 people. My personal net worth was $3.2 million in assets. The business itself was conservatively valued at $5 million. And my family thought I had some kind of event planning thing that I did as a hobby, something cute and small that kept me busy, because I had learned years ago that talking about my success only led to dismissal or worse, the subtle implication that I was bragging or making things up. Amanda made $67,000 a year as a middle manager at a medical supply company, a perfectly respectable salary for honest work, but she was treated like she'd conquered the corporate world while I built an actual empire that my family couldn't see because they'd decided long ago who I was and refused to update their perception. My mother made constant comparisons, always with Amanda as the favorable benchmark. Amanda has such a stable job. Amanda is so responsible with her money. Amanda made such a smart choice marrying Josh right out of college. My father, Richard, never contradicted her, never defended me, just remained silent, or offered weak platitudes that somehow made me feel worse than my mother's direct criticism. The extended family had long ago learned to defer to my mother's judgment of me. Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, treated me with the sort of sympathetic concern usually reserved for people with chronic illnesses. Uncle Tim, my father's brother, was kind but distant, as though my supposed instability might be contagious. My grandmother had simply written me off as the disappointment, her lips pursed in perpetual disapproval whenever I entered a room. I had spent years trying to win their approval, achieving more and more, thinking that surely this accomplishment would be the one that made them see me, really see me. When I bought my first investment property at 25, a small commercial building that I renovated and leased to a coffee shop, my father had said, "Are you sure you can handle that responsibility, Claire Bear?" Using the childhood nickname that made me feel like I was still 12 years old and incapable of adult decisions. When I landed my first major consulting contract, a $200,000 deal with a hotel chain to redesign their event spaces across 6 properties, my mother's response had been, "That's nice, dear. Amanda got Employee of the Month, and they gave her a parking space." I remembered Amanda's wedding 4 years ago, a beautiful event that I had contributed $15,000 toward, specifically paying for all the floral arrangements because I knew Amanda had always dreamed of having roses everywhere. And during the reception speech, my parents had thanked everyone who had helped make the day special and taken credit for the flowers themselves, never mentioning my gift. And I had sat at my table swallowing the hurt because making a scene would only confirm their belief that I was difficult. That was the night I met David, actually. He had been the architect who designed the addition to the venue where Amanda got married, and he was there checking on some final details. And we'd started talking at the bar where I was hiding from my family. And he'd asked what I did, and I'd told him about my business, and he'd been genuinely interested, asking real questions, impressed by what I'd built. And I remembered thinking, this is what it feels like to be seen. David came from a normal family, a supportive family, where achievements were celebrated regardless of whose they were, where different paths were valued rather than compared, where love wasn't conditional on fitting into predetermined boxes. His parents, Karen and Tom, had welcomed me immediately, asked me about my business with genuine curiosity, attended my venue openings, celebrated my success without qualifications or caveats. His sister Emma had become a real friend, someone who texted me about things other than family obligations, who wanted to grab coffee and hear about my life. Being with David's family showed me just how broken my own family dynamics were, how distorted their perception of me had become. And for 4 years, I'd been trying to manage the cognitive dissonance of knowing my own worth while watching my family refuse to acknowledge it. I had kept quiet about owning Meridian Grand when David and I got engaged and started planning the wedding there, telling my family simply that we'd booked a venue, and deflecting their questions about cost with vague statements about having vendor connections, because I'd learned that revealing the truth would only lead to skepticism and questions about how I could possibly afford such things, and implications that I was being financially irresponsible or lying about my success. The phone calls started within minutes of that group text, my phone vibrating continuously on the consultation table until I finally turned off the ringer and watched the screen light up over and over with incoming calls from my mother, my father, Amanda, Aunt Carol, each of them wanting to explain to me why they were right to cancel my wedding, why this intervention was necessary, why I should be grateful they loved me enough to save me from myself. I let them all go to voicemail, my hands still shaking, Jessica sitting beside me in supportive silence, until finally I picked up when my mother called for the fourth time, and her voice came through sharp and certain, in that tone she'd always used when she'd decided something about my life without consulting me. "Claire, I know you're upset, but you need to understand we're doing this because we love you. David seems nice, but you barely know him." I closed my eyes and counted to 5 before responding, my voice steadier than I felt. "Mom, we've been together for 4 years." There was a pause, then she continued as if I hadn't spoken. "4 years isn't that long, sweetheart. You're rushing into this. When you're older and more mature, you'll understand why we had to step in." I was 28 years old, older than she'd been when she married my father, but pointing that out would be useless because the rules had always been different for me, the standards higher, the benefit of the doubt permanently withheld. Amanda called next, her voice dripping with the fake concern she'd perfected over the years, that sister knows best tone that made my teeth clench. "Claire, we love you. We just think you're rushing into this. Marriage is such a big commitment. And you've never been good at thinking long-term. Never been good at thinking long-term, as if building a multi-million-dollar business from nothing didn't require long-term thinking, as if purchasing and renovating 5 properties didn't demonstrate commitment, as if every single achievement I'd worked for hadn't required more long-term planning than she'd ever attempted." My father called with his usual weak deflection, his voice gentle but ultimately supporting my mother's crusade. "Claire Bear, your mother might have a point. We just want what's best for you. Maybe you could postpone for a while. Give yourself more time to be sure." I hung up on him, something I'd never done before, and immediately felt guilty even though I knew I shouldn't. Even though they were the ones trying to sabotage my wedding 3 weeks before it was supposed to happen. David arrived at the venue 20 minutes after the calls started, his face flushed with anger, and he pulled me into his arms while I finally let myself cry, and he said, "This is insane. They can't do this. We're getting married, Claire. I don't care what they say." But they thought they could do this. That was the devastating part. They thought they had the right to make this decision for me, to override my choices, to determine what was best for my life, and when I finally listened to my voicemail messages, I learned they'd held an emergency family meeting the night before, everyone except me invited, and they'd systematically decided I wasn't mature enough for marriage, that David was probably a mistake. that someone needed to intervene before I embarrassed myself, and they'd already started calling guests to inform them the wedding was canceled due to family concerns about the bride's readiness. Jessica handed me tissues while I listened to message after message, each family member explaining their role in saving me from myself. And then my phone started ringing again, this time from vendors, the florist and the caterer and the photographer, all confused because they'd received calls from someone claiming to be my mother, saying the wedding was canceled and they should halt all preparations. I took a breath and called each vendor back, my voice calm and professional, and told them to proceed exactly as planned, that there was a family misunderstanding, but the wedding was absolutely happening. And because I'd worked with most of these vendors for years through my business, they trusted me immediately and assured me everything would continue on schedule. What my family didn't know, what they couldn't have known because I'd kept it quiet to avoid exactly this kind of drama, was that the venue they thought they'd canceled was mine, that Meridian Grand belonged to me, that the $15,000 rental fee I'd waived for my own wedding was money I was paying to myself. And when my mother had called the venue to cancel, she'd spoken to my front desk manager, Marissa, who knew perfectly well who owned the property, and had smoothly assured my mother that everything would be handled without ever actually agreeing to cancel anything. I started laughing then, slightly hysterical, because the absurdity of the situation was almost too much to process. My family trying to cancel a venue I owned, thinking they'd succeeded in stopping my wedding when all they'd really done was reveal just how little they knew about my life, how completely they'd dismissed everything I'd built, how thoroughly they'd refused to see me as anything other than the problem child who needed constant supervision and correction. David watched me laugh and cry simultaneously, then said quietly, "What do we do now?" And I looked around the consultation room at Meridian Grand, at the venue I'd purchased and renovated, and built into the most sought-after wedding location in the region, at the physical manifestation of everything I'd achieved while my family thought I was playing at having a business. And I made a decision that felt like breaking free and coming home at the same time. We let them think they won. We let them believe they successfully canceled everything. And then we get married exactly as planned, right here, and we let them discover the truth on their own terms. Ciao. Part 4. The memories came in flashes, each one a small cut that had healed into scar tissue I'd stopped noticing until now, when the pattern became impossible to ignore. And I sat in my office at Meridian Grand, the day after the cancellation calls had finally stopped, staring at my laptop screen where I'd pulled up old photos and emails, trying to understand when exactly my family had decided I was incapable and why I'd spent so long trying to prove them wrong. My college graduation had been on a Saturday in May, unseasonably hot, and I'd walked across that stage magna cum laude with a degree in business and hospitality management. My scholarship covering every penny of tuition because I'd worked that hard, and my family had arrived 45 minutes late because Amanda had needed help moving some furniture in her apartment that morning, and they'd stayed for the ceremony itself, but left immediately after for Amanda's company dinner, some casual work event that apparently couldn't be rescheduled, and I'd stood in my cap and gown watching them hurry to their car, while my roommate's family invited me to their celebration dinner because they felt sorry for me. I remembered calling my mother 3 years after graduation, 27 years old, and barely able to contain my excitement, telling her I'd just signed a consulting contract with a major hotel chain worth $200,000, the kind of deal that validated everything I'd built, that proved Meridian Events Hospitality was a real company with real value, and she'd said, "That's nice, dear," in that distracted tone she used when she wasn't really listening, and then immediately, "Did you hear Amanda got Employee of the Month? They gave her a plaque and everything. We're going to dinner to celebrate on Saturday, you should come." The memory that hurt most was buying my first investment property at 25, a small commercial building in a developing neighborhood that I'd seen potential in, that I'd run the numbers on obsessively, that I'd secured financing for through my business plan and projections. And when I'd called my father so proud to tell him I was a property owner, that I'd made this huge adult investment, He'd said, "Are you sure you can handle that responsibility, Claire Bear?" In that gentle, concerned voice that made me feel like I was still a child playing dress-up in adult clothes, and I'd hung up feeling my excitement drain away into familiar doubt. Amanda's wedding 4 years ago had been beautiful, everything she'd dreamed of, and I'd been genuinely happy for her, wanted to give her something special, so I'd paid $15,000 for all the floral arrangements, every rose and hydrangea and delicate spray of baby's breath, because she'd always loved flowers and I knew the budget was tight. And during the reception speech, my parents had stood up and thanked everyone who'd helped make the day so special and mentioned the beautiful flowers we were able to provide, without ever acknowledging that I'd paid for them, that my gift had been substantial. And I'd sat at my table swallowing champagne and hurt in equal measure because making a scene would only confirm I was difficult, ungrateful, always causing problems. The pattern was so clear now, looking back with eyes that weren't clouded by desperate need for approval. My money was welcomed but never acknowledged, my contributions taken for granted as though they appeared by magic, my success systematically minimized or attributed to luck, or questioned as potentially irresponsible. Meridian Events. Hospitality, the company I'd built from absolutely nothing, owned 5 venue properties across the greater metro area. Meridian Grand, the historic mansion that was my flagship property worth $2.1 million. Meridian Loft, an industrial chic space in the downtown arts district. Meridian Gardens, an outdoor venue with mature trees and a stone pavilion. Meridian Estate, a rustic barn property that hosted country, elegant weddings. And Meridian Terrace, a rooftop urban space with skyline views. My company grossed $3.8 million annually, employed 47 people full-time, held consulting contracts with 3 major hotel chains, and had been featured in regional business publications twice. My personal net worth was $3.2 million in assets, real estate investments that generated passive income, and the business itself was conservatively valued at $5 million. And my family thought I had some kind of event planning thing that I did as a hobby, something cute that kept me busy, because I'd learned years ago that talking about my success led nowhere good, led to skeptical questions or comments about how I shouldn't work so hard, or suggestions that I was exaggerating or bragging. Amanda made $67,000 a year as a middle manager at a medical supply company, a perfectly respectable salary for honest work that required showing up and doing her job well, and she was treated like she'd conquered the corporate world, like her Employee of the Month plaques were equivalent to building an empire from the ground up, and I'd spent so long telling myself that comparison was unfair to Amanda, that it wasn't her fault our parents had different standards for us. But the truth was, she'd never once stood up for me, never once suggested that maybe my achievements deserved equal celebration, never once questioned why our parents dismissed everything I built. I pulled up my business bank statements, looking at numbers that told a story my family had refused to hear. Revenue growth year over year, payroll for 47 employees and their families, vendor payments that supported dozens of other small businesses, profit margins that proved this wasn't luck or accident, but careful planning and hard work and business acumen they'd decided I didn't possess. I realized sitting there in my office, surrounded by the physical evidence of everything I'd achieved, that I'd built this company partially to finally impress them, to finally make them see me as capable and successful and worthy of respect. But somewhere along the way, I'd also found genuine passion for this work, had discovered I loved creating beautiful spaces where people celebrated the most important moments of their lives, had built something that mattered beyond my family's approval. And that was the part they'd never understand, because they'd never asked, never wanted to know, never been curious enough about my life to discover that I'd become someone extraordinary while they were busy looking elsewhere. The Facebook post appeared on my mother's page 3 days after the group text, And I stared at my phone screen, feeling something crack inside my chest as I read her carefully worded announcement that my wedding had been canceled due to serious family concerns about the bride's readiness for such a significant commitment. The post written in that tone of sorrowful wisdom she used when she wanted sympathy, when she wanted people to understand how difficult it was to have a daughter like me. And within an hour, there were 37 comments from family friends and distant relatives, all expressing their support for this difficult decision and hoping I would get the help I needed. My phone started ringing immediately with guests calling confused because some of them had seen the post. Others had received direct calls from my mother or Amanda, explaining that the wedding was off, that there were concerns, that everyone should make other plans for August 12th, and I spent 2 hours that Tuesday afternoon sending individual messages to all 150 invited guests, explaining that the wedding was absolutely still happening, that there had been a family misunderstanding, that I hoped they would still plan to attend, because David and I were getting married exactly as scheduled. Some of the guests were close family friends who'd known me since childhood, and I watched in real time as they reported back to my mother that I was still insisting the wedding would happen, still refusing to accept reality. And when my mother called that evening, her voice was a combination of concern and fury that I'd become familiar with over 28 years, the tone that said she was disappointed in me again, that I was making everything harder than it needed to be, that she was tired of my drama. "Claire, how dare you go behind our backs and contact our friends after we specifically told them the wedding was canceled," she said. And I felt something shift in my chest, something that had been bending for years finally straightening into steel. "It's my wedding, Mom," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. And there was a pause on her end, as if she couldn't quite believe I'd said something so simple, so obvious, so completely reasonable. "We're doing this for you, Claire. You've always been impulsive, rushing into things without thinking them through, and we're not going to stand by and watch you make another mistake." I closed my eyes and counted to 5, reminding myself that engaging with her distorted version of reality wouldn't change anything, wouldn't make her suddenly see reason or acknowledge that being with someone for 4 years wasn't impulsive, that building a multi-million-dollar business from nothing required careful planning, that everything she was saying was a reflection of how little she actually knew about my life. "I've been with David 4 years," I said, keeping my voice level, and she made that dismissive sound she always made when I contradicted her, that little exhale that meant she thought I was being deliberately difficult. "That's not long enough, Claire. When you're older and more mature, you'll understand why we had to step in, why someone needed to protect you from yourself." She was 49 years old when she said that to me, and I was 28, older than she'd been when she married my father, after dating him for 18 months, but pointing out that hypocrisy would only make her defensive, would only prove in her mind that I was argumentative and disrespectful. So I said nothing, and let her words hang in the air between us, until she filled the silence with more reasons why she was right, why I should be grateful, why this intervention was necessary. Amanda called an hour later with her version of concern, that practiced tone of fake worry that she'd perfected over the years, and she said, "Claire, we love you. We just don't want you to make a mistake like—" And then she trailed off, letting the implication hang there that everything I did was a mistake, every choice I made was questionable, every path I chose was the wrong one, and I felt that steel in my chest grow stronger. David's parents called that same evening, his mother Karen's voice warm and genuinely concerned, and she said they'd heard there was some family confusion about the wedding, and they wanted us to know they were there to support us however we needed, and when she delicately offered to help with costs. If that was the issue, I felt tears prick my eyes, because the assumption that we might need financial help was so far from the truth, but came from such a kind place. And I thanked her and declined and told her everything was fine, the wedding was happening, there was just some family drama that would resolve itself. My decision crystallized that night sitting in my home office, David beside me on the couch, both of us exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of phone calls and texts and explanations. and I realized I was done trying to make them see me, done trying to prove myself, done hoping that maybe this time they'd recognize my worth. And instead, I would simply let them think they'd won, let them believe they'd successfully canceled the wedding, let them think they'd saved me from myself, and then David and I would get married exactly as planned at Meridian Grand, the venue they thought they'd canceled, the property they didn't know I owned, and they would discover the truth on their own terms when reality crashed through their delusion on August 12th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Part 6. The text message from my mother arrived on Thursday morning, 10 days after the initial cancellation announcement, and it was written in that deceptively casual tone that I'd learned meant something serious was coming. Claire, we'd like you and David to come to the house on Saturday at 2 p.m. The whole family will be there. We need to talk about this situation before it goes any further. I stared at the message knowing exactly what it was, knowing they were organizing some kind of intervention or family meeting where they'd all take turns explaining why I was making a mistake, why they knew better, why I should listen to them, and my first instinct was to decline, to say I was busy, to avoid the whole painful spectacle. But David saw my face and asked what was wrong, and when I showed him the text, he said, "Let's go. Let them say whatever they need to say. It won't change anything." So Saturday afternoon we drove to my parents' house in the suburbs, the house I'd grown up in, and when we arrived I could see my father's car and Amanda's SUV and my aunt and uncle's sedan all lined up in the driveway like they were gathering for something momentous, and David squeezed my hand as we walked to the front door and whispered, "Remember, we know the truth. They're the ones who are confused." My mother answered the door with that concerned expression she wore when she thought she was doing something difficult but necessary, and she hugged me like I was fragile, like I might break, and ushered us into the living room where everyone was already assembled. My father in his usual armchair, Amanda and her husband Josh on the love seat, Aunt Carol and Uncle Tim on the sofa, and my grandmother in the other armchair looking stern and disapproving, and the only seats left were two chairs that had been positioned in the center of the room facing everyone else. And I realized with a sick feeling that David and I were meant to sit there like we were on trial, like we were children being called to account. And my mother gestured to the chairs and said, "Please sit down. We've brought you here because we love you." David and I sat, and I felt all their eyes on me, felt the weight of their judgment and concern and certainty that they were right, and my mother began, "Claire, we've talked about this as a family, and we're all in agreement that this wedding needs to be postponed indefinitely until you're really ready for such a serious commitment." And Amanda chimed in immediately with, "You've never been good at thinking long-term, Claire. You get excited about things and jump in without really thinking them through." And I wanted to ask her what exactly she meant by that, wanted to point out that I'd built a business that required years of planning and strategic thinking. But I stayed quiet because I'd already decided to let them talk, to let them reveal exactly how little they knew about me. And Aunt Carol added, "Remember when you dropped out of that pottery class in high school? You were so excited at first and then you just quit. Marriage isn't something you can quit when it gets hard." And I felt David stiffen beside me, because she was comparing a pottery class I'd taken 13 years ago when I was 15 to the most important commitment of my life. And Uncle Tim looked at David with what seemed like genuine sympathy and said, "David, you seem like a good guy, a solid guy. Are you sure about this? Because Claire has a history of impulsive decisions." And my grandmother said nothing, but her expression conveyed everything. That look of disappointment I'd seen my entire life. And my father cleared his throat and said, "Claire, honey, you have to admit you've made some questionable choices over the years." And then they started listing them. My college boyfriend, who I dated for 6 months 8 years ago and broken up with because we wanted different things, quitting my corporate job to start my own business, which they still saw as reckless and unstable, even though that decision had made me a millionaire, buying too much real estate, which they thought was risky, and overextending myself, even though those properties were worth over $3 million and generated steady passive income. And with each example they gave, I felt more clarity, saw more plainly how every achievement in my life had been reframed in their minds as an impulsive mistake, how they'd taken my courage and called it recklessness, taken my business acumen and called it luck, taken my success and refused to see it as anything but accidents and gambles that happened to work out. David tried to defend me, started to say, "With all due respect, Claire has built an incredibly successful business." But my mother cut him off gently but firmly. "This doesn't concern you yet, David. We're her family. We've known her whole life. We know patterns you can't see." And I put my hand on David's knee to tell him it was okay, to let them talk, because I was seeing something clearly for the first time in my life, seeing how fundamentally distorted their perception of me was, how they'd constructed a version of Claire in their minds that had nothing to do with who I actually was, and no amount of arguing or defending would change that narrative they'd committed to. And I realized sitting there in that living room surrounded by my family that the only thing that would penetrate their delusion was reality itself, undeniable and unavoidable, and that reality would arrive in exactly 1 week when they showed up at Meridian Grand expecting an empty building and found instead a wedding in full swing at a venue I owned. But for now, I sat quietly and let them talk until they'd exhausted themselves, until my mother finally said, "So we're all agreed? You'll postpone the wedding and take some time to really think about whether this is right?" And I said simply, "I've heard everything you have to say. Thank you for your concern," which wasn't an agreement, but they took it as one, took my silence and politeness as capitulation. And when David and I left an hour later, my mother hugged me at the door and said, "You'll thank us for this someday, sweetheart." And we drove home in silence until David finally said, "That was insane. Those people are completely delusional." And I said quietly, "I know, and I'm done." Part 7. Monday morning, I met Jessica at Meridian Grand, my wedding planner who also happened to be one of my most trusted employees. And as we walked through the venue together reviewing every detail, I felt something shift inside me. A sense of purpose replacing the hurt that had dominated the past 2 weeks, because this was my domain, my creation, my empire, and no amount of family delusion could change that reality. Jessica had known about the family situation from the beginning, had kept my ownership of the venue quiet per my request, because I'd wanted to avoid the inevitable drama of my mother having opinions about every choice I made, wanted this one thing in my life to be mine, without her commentary or Amanda's subtle dismissals. And as we confirmed the catering menu, and reviewed the floral arrangements, and checked on the string quartet, and verified the photography timeline, Jessica looked at me with that direct gaze she had and said, "I've coordinated over 300 weddings at this venue alone, and I've seen every kind of family drama you can imagine, but this is honestly next level." And I laughed because she was right. This was beyond typical family conflict, beyond normal wedding stress. This was a systematic attempt to cancel my wedding based on a completely distorted perception of who I was and what I'd achieved. The guest list was solid despite my family's interference. 150 people had confirmed attendance, most of them simply ignoring the confusing messages from my mother and Amanda, and as I reviewed the seating chart, I made a decision that had been forming since Saturday's intervention, a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary, and I told Jessica, "I want to invite my family to the venue on wedding day, not as regular guests who arrive for the ceremony, but I want them to know that morning that the wedding is happening here, happening now, and I want them to see what they tried to destroy." And Jessica studied my face for a moment before nodding and saying, "I think that's the right call. They need to see the truth. But are you prepared for however they react?" And I said, "I don't think I have a choice anymore. This isn't about revenge or proving myself. It's about reality. They're living in a delusion where I'm incompetent and impulsive, and the only thing that will break through that is confronting them with undeniable evidence." And we continued through the venue, through the grand ballroom with its crystal chandeliers, that I'd personally selected during the renovation, past the garden ceremony space that had taken 6 months to landscape properly, and I felt pride welling up in my chest because this was my pride and joy, this property that I'd bought 3 years ago as a historic mansion in need of serious renovation that I'd poured 2 years of work and careful planning into restoring. That had become my flagship venue, booking over 80 events per year and generating the largest portion of my company's revenue. I thought about my other 4 properties as Jessica and I walked the grounds. Meridian Loft with its industrial chic aesthetic and exposed brick that appealed to younger couples wanting something modern. Meridian Gardens with its outdoor ceremony spaces and natural beauty perfect for spring and summer weddings. Meridian Estate with its rustic barn charm that had become increasingly popular. And Meridian Terrace with its rooftop urban views that commanded premium pricing. And altogether, these 5 venues employed 47 people full-time, people who depended on the business I'd built, families who were supported by my success. And my family thought I had some kind of event planning thing, like it was a hobby I played at between more serious pursuits. And the absurdity of that disconnect hit me fully as I stood in my own property worth $2.1 million. David arrived around noon, finding us in the garden reviewing the ceremony layout, and he kissed my cheek and asked how I was feeling, and I said, "I'm ready, I'm actually ready." And as we walked the grounds together, just the 2 of us, after Jessica excused herself to handle some vendor coordination, David said quietly, "Are you sure about inviting them? They don't deserve to be there, Claire. They tried to destroy this day." And I stopped walking and turned to face him. This man who had stood by me through every moment of my family's dysfunction, who had defended me when I couldn't defend myself, who had never once asked me to be smaller or less successful or more palatable, and I said, "I need them to see it, David. I need them to understand what they tried to take from me, not because I need their approval anymore. I don't. I really don't. But because they need to see the truth, and maybe that truth will finally break through whatever narrative they've constructed about who I am." And he pulled me close and said, "Okay, we'll do it your way. But the moment they cause problems, they're gone. This is our day, not theirs." And I agreed because he was right. This was about showing them reality, not about giving them power over my happiness. And as we stood there in the garden, that would be transformed into a floral paradise in 5 days, I realized that this moment wasn't about proving myself anymore. Wasn't about finally winning their approval or making them see my worth. This was simply about showing the truth, letting reality speak for itself, and whatever they did with that information was their choice to make. Part 8. The call came on Tuesday morning, 4 days before the wedding, and I saw my mother's name on the screen and felt my stomach tighten because I knew she hadn't given up, knew she was still operating under the delusion that she'd successfully prevented my wedding, and when I answered, she said without preamble, "Claire, I hope you've come to your senses by now. Have you and David postponed things properly? Notified everyone officially?" And I took a breath and said calmly, "The wedding is this Saturday, Mom, August 12th at 2 o'clock." And there was a pause before she laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Claire, don't be ridiculous, there's no venue. We made sure of that." And my blood ran cold because I hadn't known they'd actually called Meridian Grand, hadn't known they'd taken that step, and I said carefully, "What do you mean you made sure of that?" And my mother's voice was so certain, so satisfied when she said, "We called that place Meridian Grand several weeks ago. We explained the situation to them, told them that the bride wasn't in a stable position for marriage and that the wedding needed to be canceled, and they were very understanding about the whole thing, said they'd take care of everything." And I closed my eyes trying to process this, trying to imagine that conversation. My mother calling my own venue, speaking to my own employees, telling them I was unstable, and I asked, "What exactly did they say to you, Mom?" "Their exact words." And she said impatiently, "They said they'd handle it, that we shouldn't worry, that everything would be taken care of. So you see, Even the venue people could tell this wasn't right. Even strangers could see you weren't ready for this. And in that moment, I made my decision. Decided to stop protecting her from reality. Stop letting her live in this fantasy world where she'd successfully saved me from myself. And I said clearly, Mom, the wedding is this Saturday at 2 p.m. at Meridian Grand, 847 Oak Valley Road. You and Dad and the rest of the family can come or not. That's your choice, but it's happening. And my mother's voice rose in frustration. There is no venue, Claire. When will you stop living in Fantasyland? When will you accept reality? And I said quietly, Saturday at 2. I'll have someone at the door with your names. I really hope you'll be there. And I hung up before she could respond, and immediately called Jessica, who answered on the first ring, and I said, Did my mother call the venue to cancel? And Jessica said, Oh yes, about 2 weeks ago. She spoke to Marissa at the front desk. It was quite a conversation, apparently. And I asked, What did my mother say exactly? And Jessica's voice was careful when she said, She was pretty condescending from what Marissa told me. Said you were troubled, that you weren't stable enough for marriage, that the family was canceling for your own good. She talked to Marissa like she expected us to just agree with her assessment and cancel everything. And I asked, What did Marissa say? And Jessica laughed softly. Marissa told her we'd handle everything and not to worry, that we'd take care of it. Very professional, very polite. I think your mom assumed that meant we were canceling, but Marissa just meant we'd handle her call and not bother you with it. And I found myself laughing too, really laughing for the first time in weeks. Because my employee had been so perfectly diplomatic, had let my mother hear what she wanted to hear without actually agreeing to anything. And when I told David about the conversation that evening, he stared at me in disbelief and said, So they think they actually succeeded in canceling the venue? They think the wedding isn't happening? And I nodded and said, They think they saved me from myself. And David shook his head and said, This is going to be quite a shock for them on Saturday. And I sent one final text to the family group chat, formal and clear. Wedding is Saturday, August 12th, 2 p.m., Meridian Grand, 847 Oak Valley Road. Your attendance is optional, but you're invited. And the responses came immediately, dripping with condescension and pity. Amanda writing, Claire, this is sad. The venue canceled. Please stop this. And my mother, Sweetheart, we spoke to them ourselves. Please accept reality and we can help you through this. And Aunt Carol, someone needs to do a wellness check. This isn't healthy. And I read each message and felt nothing but clarity. Nothing but certainty that Saturday would be the day reality finally broke through their delusion. And I turned off my phone and spent the rest of the week in final preparations, letting them believe whatever they needed to believe until the truth became unavoidable. Part 9. Saturday morning arrived with that crystalline quality of late summer, the kind of day that seemed designed specifically for outdoor celebrations. And I was at Meridian Grand by 7 a.m., watching my venue transform into something that existed somewhere between dream and reality. The garden ceremony space being dressed in thousands of white roses that caught the early light like they were holding their own internal glow. The grand ballroom being set with crystal and gold accents that would sparkle under the chandeliers I'd personally selected during the 2-year renovation that had turned this historic mansion into my flagship property. My staff of 20 moved through their preparations with the efficiency that came from executing over 80 events per year in this space alone. And I watched the caterers arrange their stations and the florists position centerpieces, and the musicians set up their instruments, and the photographers test their lighting. And every single person on my team knew about the family situation because I'd been honest with them about what might happen today. And Jessica found me in the foyer around 8 o'clock and said quietly, If any of them show up and cause problems, security has been briefed and will handle it immediately. And I nodded because I'd learned over the past 3 years of running this business that sometimes you need to prepare for every contingency, even while hoping for the best outcome. David's family arrived early, his mother Karen and his two sisters appearing at 9:30 to help me get ready in the bridal suite. And as I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my custom Vera Wang gown that had cost $8,500, watching Karen button the delicate pearls that ran down my spine, she said, "You look absolutely stunning, Claire, and this venue is incredible." And I said, "Thank you, Karen, for everything," meaning not just the help with the dress, but for the way David's entire family had welcomed me without reservation, without judgment, without needing me to prove myself worthy of their love. And she smiled at me in the mirror and said, "I just wish your family could see what we see." And I said quietly, "They're about to." At 10 a.m., I sent one final text to my mother, my hands steady as I typed, "Wedding begins at 2. I really hope you'll come. Whatever you think of me, I'm still your daughter and I want you there." And her response came within minutes. "Claire, I can't watch you embarrass yourself. There is no wedding. The venue is canceled. Please seek help." And I screenshot the conversation and set my phone down. And Amanda texted separately saying, "Mom's right. We're not coming to watch you have a breakdown. We love you, but this is too much." And my father's message said simply, "Claire Bear, please just come home and we'll talk about this reasonably." As if I were the one being unreasonable. As if I were the one living in a fantasy world. By noon, guests were arriving early, filling the venue with the sounds of laughter and music and celebration. And at 1 p.m., I stood fully dressed before the mirror and looked at myself. Really looked at myself, and thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. About building a multi-million-dollar business, while my family thought I was playing at event planning. About finding David who celebrated my success, instead of feeling threatened by it. About learning slowly and painfully that I couldn't make people see me if they were determined to look away. And I realized, standing there in my wedding dress in my own venue surrounded by people who loved and supported me, that I genuinely didn't need their approval anymore, but I still wanted them to know the truth, wanted them to see reality even if they chose to do nothing with that information. I made my final decision then and called my mother one more time, and when she answered with, "Claire, please," I said calmly, "Mom, I'm at Meridian Grand right now. I'm in my wedding dress. There are 150 people here. The wedding is happening in 1 hour. I'm asking you one last time. Please come." And there was silence on the other end before she said, "This is cruel, Claire. Why are you doing this?" And I asked, "Doing what?" And her voice broke when she said, "Lying about this. We canceled that venue. Why are you pretending?" And I said quietly, "Come and see for yourself. I promise you, everything is ready." And I hung up before she could respond, and I handed my phone to Jessica and said, "Whatever happens next, I'm ready." And she squeezed my hand and said, "You're going to have a beautiful wedding." And I believed her because it was already beautiful, already perfect, already everything I'd worked for and dreamed of and built with my own hands. Part 10. At 1:30 in the afternoon, my phone rang with my mother's number, and when I answered, she said without greeting, "Fine, we're coming over there to bring you home, Claire. This has gone far enough." And I immediately found Jessica and told her, "My family is coming." And she nodded once and spoke quietly into her radio. "Security, the bride's family is arriving. Let them enter but stay alert." And I positioned myself in the bridal suite where the window overlooked the entrance because I needed to see this moment, needed to watch reality collide with their delusion. And at 1:45, two cars pulled up to the circular drive. My parents in one, and Amanda with Josh and Aunt Carol and Uncle Tim in the other, and I watched them climb out and approach the entrance. And I tried to imagine what they were expecting to find. An empty building perhaps, locked doors, some evidence that would prove them right and me wrong. But instead they encountered valet parking attendants in formal uniforms and a red carpet entrance and a doorman in tails holding the door open. And Marissa stood at the entrance with her clipboard looking every inch the professional venue coordinator she was. And I saw her smile and say something, and even from my window I could see my mother's confusion. And later Marissa told me the exact exchange, how my mother had said, "We're here to... Is there actually an event happening?" And Marissa had responded with perfect professional courtesy. "Yes, ma'am. The ceremony begins in 15 minutes. May I have your names?" And my mother had stammered, "I'm Margaret Chen. This is my daughter's... Wait, I don't understand." And Marissa had consulted her clipboard and said, "Ah, yes, Mrs. Chen. We've been expecting you. Please come in." And I watched my family enter the grand foyer with its 20-foot ceilings and massive crystal chandelier and marble floors and the thousands of white roses that filled every surface. And I saw them stop and stare as guests in formal attire moved past them toward the garden. And Amanda turned to my mother and I could read her lips saying, "Mom, what is this?" And my father stood looking around like a man who had just woken in an unfamiliar room. And my mother approached Marissa again, and I saw her gesturing, clearly upset. And Marissa later told me she'd said, "I don't understand. We called to cancel this. We spoke to someone." And Marissa had replied, "Yes, ma'am, I remember that call. You spoke with me. I assured you everything would be handled." And my mother had said handled means canceled. And Marissa had explained with exquisite patience, "I meant we would handle your concerns, ma'am." The wedding was never canceled. And I saw Uncle Tim lean in and say something, and my mother's face flushed red, and Amanda asked, "Where's Claire?" And Marissa gestured toward the garden and said, "The bride is preparing for her ceremony. Would you like to be seated? The family section is front left." And my mother said, "I need to speak with whoever is in charge here." And Marissa smiled that same professional smile and said, "The owner will address that shortly. For now, may I show you to your seats?" And Aunt Carol said loud enough that I could hear it through the open window, "This venue is beautiful. How did Claire afford this?" And I watched as they were gently but firmly ushered through the foyer toward the ceremony space. And I saw them emerge into the garden and stop again, because there before them were 150 guests, seated in white chairs, a string quartet playing pachelbel, the garden transformed into something from a fairy tale with white roses climbing the arbor and petals scattered down the aisle, and David standing at the altar with his groomsmen, looking confident and happy and completely at ease. And I saw my mother lean close to my father and say something urgent, and my father put his hand on her arm and responded, and even from the bridal suite I knew he was saying, "Margaret, look around, this is really happening." And they took their seats in the front row, my mother's face cycling through shock and confusion, and something that might have been the first dawning of understanding. And I stepped back from the window and smoothed my dress, and Jessica appeared beside me and said, "It's time." And I nodded because I was ready, ready to walk down that aisle in my own venue wearing my wedding dress, to marry the man who had always seen me clearly, ready to let my family watch as everything they thought they knew revealed itself to be fiction. Part 11. At exactly 2 o'clock, the music shifted from the gentle prelude to the processional, and I began my walk down the garden aisle alone because I had chosen to walk myself into this new life. And as I moved between the rows of white chairs filled with 150 guests, I could feel every eye on me, but especially the eyes of my family in the front row, their faces registering shock and confusion and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. And I was radiantly beautiful in that moment, not because of the custom Vera Wang gown, or the professional makeup, or the perfect hair, but because I was walking in complete confidence toward a man who had always seen me clearly, and toward a future I had built with my own hands. And I saw my mother lean close to my father and whisper urgently, "We need to stop this. Something's wrong." And I saw my father put his hand on her arm and say quietly, "Margaret, look around. This is really happening." And I reached the altar where David stood with tears in his eyes and took his hands and turned to face the officiant, who was Professor Richardson from business school, the woman who had encouraged me to start my own company when everyone else told me to take the safe corporate job. And she smiled at both of us and said, We are gathered here today at this beautiful venue, Meridian Grand, to celebrate the marriage of Claire and David. And I heard Amanda whisper to Josh, "How did she even book this place? It's incredible." And the ceremony proceeded with traditional readings and heartfelt words. And when we reached the vows, David spoke first and said, "Claire, you built an empire while people doubted you. You stayed kind while people dismissed you. You're the strongest person I know, and I promise to celebrate your success every single day for the rest of our lives." And I felt tears slip down my cheeks because those words meant everything. And then I spoke my vows looking into his eyes and said, "David, you saw me when others looked through me. You celebrated my success when others minimized it. You never asked me to be less than I am, and I promise to stand beside you as your equal partner in all things." And I saw my mother crying in the front row, but I couldn't tell if it was from emotion or confusion or the slow dawning realization that she had been wrong about everything. And Professor Richardson pronounced us husband and wife, and we kissed as the guests erupted in applause, and we walked back down the aisle together as the string quartet played, and my family sat stunned and silent, and the receiving line formed in controlled chaos. And during cocktail hour in the garden, with ice sculptures melting slowly in the August heat, and waiters passing hors d'oeuvres that cost $12 per piece, and a premium open bar serving top-shelf everything, my mother approached me and said, "Sweetheart, this is all lovely, but how did you manage to put this together? Who paid for all this?" And I said gently, "We'll talk at dinner, Mom. Please just enjoy the party." And Amanda came up looking almost frantic and said, "Claire, seriously, this venue must have cost a fortune. Did David's family help you pay for it?" And I said, "No, we'll explain everything later. Just celebrate with us now." And I watched my family mingle with the other guests. And I saw the exact moment when someone said to Amanda, "You must be so proud of your sister. Meridian Grand is the best venue in the entire state." And Amanda responded, "Yes, of course. How do you know Claire?" And the woman said, "Oh, I'm one of her regular vendors. Claire's my biggest client across all 5 of her properties." And Amanda's face went blank and she said, "5 properties?" But the woman had already moved away, and I saw Uncle Tim lean toward my father and say, "Did you know Claire had multiple properties?" And my father said uncertainly, "She has that event planning business." And then I watched Aunt Carol talking to another guest who gestured around the ballroom and said, "The owner really outdid herself for her own wedding." And Aunt Carol asked, "The owner?" And the guest said brightly, "Yes, Claire, she owns Meridian Grand, didn't you know?" And walked away, leaving Aunt Carol staring after her in complete confusion. And I felt David's hand squeeze mine, and I turned to him and smiled, because the truth was beginning to emerge in fragments, and overheard conversations and casual comments from guests who had no idea they were dropping bombshells, and I knew that in just a few hours during the reception toasts, I would make everything crystal clear. But for now, I let my family piece together the puzzle, one shocked realization at a time. Part 12. The grand ballroom was revealed for the reception, and it took my breath away even though I had planned every detail. The 200-person capacity space with its crystal chandeliers catching the late afternoon light and throwing rainbows across the gold Chiavari chairs, and the centerpieces of white orchids and blush roses that cost $48 each. And the guests filed in exclaiming over the beauty of it all, while my family took their seats at a table near the front, their faces still registering shock and confusion. And as I passed by, my mother reached out and touched my arm and said, "Claire, people keep saying you own this venue. What do they mean?" And I looked down at her and said gently, "I'll explain during the toasts, Mom. Please just sit and enjoy dinner." And I moved on before she could ask anything else, and the dinner service began with plated filet mignon and Chilean sea bass, with a premium wine service that I knew cost $32 per person, and I heard Amanda whisper to Josh, "This is easily a $100,000 wedding. How is this possible?" And I saw my father looking around the ballroom slowly, as if calculating costs and trying to make the numbers work in his head. And then the DJ announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, Please welcome for the first time Mr. and Mrs. Morrison. And David and I entered to thunderous applause and made our way to the dance floor for our first dance to At Last by Etta James, and traditionally the father-daughter dance would come next, but I had deliberately chosen to dance with David's father instead. And I saw my mother notice this choice and the hurt that flickered across her face. And then the toasts began with David's brother, as best man, telling funny stories about David's devotion to me and welcoming me warmly into their family. And then, my maid of honor, Sarah, who had been my roommate in college, took the microphone and said, "Claire is the most determined person I know. She set out to build something extraordinary, and she did it, against all odds." And she looked pointedly toward my family's table as she said those last words. And then the DJ said, "And now, the bride would like to say a few words." And I took the microphone with David standing beside me with his hand on my back. And I looked out at the 150 guests and said, "Thank you all for being here today. Your presence means everything to us." And then I paused and said, "Some of you know that the past few weeks have been complicated." And I saw my mother shift uncomfortably in her seat, and I continued, "My family tried to cancel this wedding. They thought they were protecting me." And there were gasps from guests who hadn't known, and I said, "They called venues, contacted guests, told everyone I wasn't ready for marriage." And Amanda was staring down at the table, and I said, "Specifically, they called this venue, Meridian Grand, to cancel." And the room went very quiet, and I said, "What they didn't know is that I own Meridian Grand." And there was complete silence followed by murmurs rippling through the crowd, and my mother's face cycled through shock and confusion and something that looked like denial, and I continued, "I also own 4 other event venues in this region through my company, Meridian Events Hospitality." And I saw my father's face drain of color. And I said, when my mother called to cancel, she spoke to my employee who politely told her everything would be handled. And some guests laughed at this. And I said, "My family has spent years minimizing my success. My business has been called that event planning thing, my achievements attributed to luck." And I paused and said, "So they had no idea that this venue, this $2.1 million property, is mine." And I saw my father grip the edge of the table. And I finished, "They didn't know my company grossed $3.8 million last year, or that we employ 47 people." And I let those numbers hang in the air while my family sat in stunned silence, trying to process this information that contradicted everything they thought they knew about me. Part 13. I continued speaking, and the microphone felt solid in my hand, and I said, "I'm not saying this to brag. I'm saying it because I want everyone here to understand something." And I paused and looked out at all the faces watching me and said, "Your worth isn't determined by who sees it. Your success isn't less real because someone refuses to acknowledge it." And then I looked directly at my family's table and said, "I spent years trying to earn approval from people who were determined not to give it." And I saw my mother's face crumple, and I said, "I built an empire one event at a time. I created jobs. I transformed properties. I made dreams come true for thousands of couples." And my voice grew stronger as I continued. "And through it all, my family thought I was just playing at having a business." And my mother suddenly stood up and said, "Claire, we didn't know." And I said gently but firmly, "Please sit down, Mom. I'm not finished." And she sat back down with tears streaming down her face, and I continued, "You tried to cancel my wedding for my own good. You decided I wasn't mature enough, stable enough, ready enough." And I let that sink in before saying, "You made that decision without knowing anything about my life, my success, or my capability." And I gestured around the ballroom and said, "The venue you thought you canceled? I've owned it for 3 years. The wedding you thought you stopped? I planned every detail through my own company." And I paused and said, "So here's what I need you to understand. I don't need your approval anymore." And my voice broke slightly as I said, "I wanted it. For so long, I desperately wanted it." And I felt David's hand on my back supporting me, and I continued, "But I've built a life I'm proud of. I've found a partner who celebrates me. I've created something meaningful. And I looked at my family and said, "You're my family and I love you. That's why you're here today." And then I said clearly, "But I'm done trying to prove myself to people who are determined not to see me." And I raised my glass and said, "To everyone here who has supported me, believed in me, and celebrated my success, thank you." And then looking at my family, I said, "And to my family, the door is always open if you want to really know me, but I'm done making myself smaller for your comfort." And I drank from my glass and then said, "Now please, enjoy this party. The bar is open, the food is incredible, and we're here to celebrate love." And I set down the microphone, and the room erupted in a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever, while my family sat in stunned silence, and I saw Amanda crying openly with her face in her hands, and my mother's face cycling through shame and shock and something that looked like the painful process of understanding. And my father was staring at me as if he were seeing me for the first time in his life. And David took my hand, and we returned to our sweetheart table, and he leaned close and whispered, "You were perfect. I'm so proud of you." And I whispered back, "I feel like I can breathe for the first time in years." And the reception continued around us with music and dancing and celebration, while my family remained at their table barely moving. And I knew that everything had changed in those few minutes, that I had spoken a truth that couldn't be unspoken, and that whatever happened next would be on my terms. Part 14. The reception continued around us, with dancing and cake cutting and celebration while my family remained seated at their table barely touching the food that cost $32 per plate. And I could see them sitting in stunned silence, trying to process everything I had said. And during the dessert course, my mother stood up and approached our sweetheart table and said, "Claire, can we talk? Privately?" And I looked at her and said, "Anything you have to say can be said here, Mom," because I was done with private conversations where things got said that could later be denied or reframed. But she said, "Please, 5 minutes." And I looked at David, who nodded his support, and I followed my mother out to the private terrace that overlooked the gardens where we had been married just hours before. And she turned to me with tears in her eyes and said, "I don't even know what to say. We had no idea." And I said quietly, "That's the problem, Mom. You had no idea because you never asked, you never wanted to know." And she said, "That's not fair. We always cared about you." And I felt something break open inside me, and I said, "Did you? When's the last time you asked about my business? When have you ever asked to see one of my properties?" And she was silent, and I continued, "I invited you to my grand opening 3 years ago. You said you were busy. Amanda's work potluck was the same day." And I saw her face change as she remembered. And I said, "I told you I signed a major hotel consulting contract worth $200,000. You changed the subject to Amanda's performance review." And my voice was steady but full of years of accumulated hurt. And I said, "I've been successful right in front of you, and you refused to see it." And my mother was crying now, and she said, Amanda was always so easy, clear path, stable job. You were different." We worried, and I said firmly, "Different doesn't mean less. It never did." And she said, "I'm sorry. I truly didn't understand." And I believed her because I could see the genuine shock and shame on her face. And I said, "I know, and I forgive you. But things have to change." And I gestured back toward the reception, where David was visible through the windows, and I said, "If you want to be in my life, in our life, you have to see me. Really see me." And she nodded and said, "How do we fix this?" And I said, "You start by asking questions, learning who I actually am, celebrating what I've built instead of minimizing it." And then I said, "And you stop comparing me to Amanda. We're different people with different paths." And she said, "You're right. You're completely right. Can we try again?" And I said, "Yes, but on my terms this time, with boundaries." And we embraced, and she was still crying, and I felt something shift between us. Not fixed, but beginning to heal. And we returned to the reception where Amanda was waiting near the terrace door, and she said, "Claire, I'm so sorry. I've been terrible to you." And then she said, I think I was jealous. You were always so fearless, starting your own thing. I played it safe. And I looked at my sister and saw her clearly for perhaps the first time. And I said, Amanda, you don't have to apologize for your choices, just stop dismissing mine. And she said, I will, I promise. Can I, can I come see one of your other venues sometime? Learn about what you do? And I said, I'd like that. And then my father approached and said, Claire Bear, I'm proud of you. I should have said it a long time ago. And I said, thank you, Dad. That means more than you know. And I meant it because despite everything, I still loved them and wanted them in my life, just differently than before. And the reception continued, and I watched my family slowly begin to engage with the celebration they had tried to destroy, and I felt David's hand find mine, and I knew that whatever happened next, I had finally spoken my truth. Part 15. The reception wound down as 11 o'clock approached, and guests began departing with warm embraces and congratulations, and David and I prepared for our sparkler exit, with all 150 guests lined up outside Meridian Grand, holding sparklers that cast golden light across the garden where we had been married just hours before. And we ran through that tunnel of light to the vintage car, waiting to take us to the hotel suite I had booked months ago, when I still thought my family would celebrate this day with genuine joy. And as we drove away, I looked back to see my family still standing at the entrance helping coordinate departing guests. And my mother was speaking to Jessica with what looked like genuine appreciation on her face. And 1 month later, I sat in my office at Meridian Grand reviewing contracts for upcoming events, when my mother called to ask if she and my father could take David and me to dinner that week. And that dinner became a weekly tradition where we actually discussed my work, and my parents asked questions about the business with what seemed like genuine interest. And Amanda visited Meridian Grand 2 weeks after the wedding, bringing 3 friends for a tour, and she booked her company's holiday party for December at a cost of $8,000. And my mother posted on Facebook a lengthy apology and celebration of my accomplishments that read, I'm ashamed to say I didn't know my own daughter. Claire owns 5 event venues and runs a multi-million-dollar company. I'm incredibly proud and sorry I didn't see it sooner. And the comments flooded in from family friends who were shocked at the revelation, and many admitted they had also underestimated me. And my business thrived in the aftermath as the wedding publicity brought new bookings and inquiries about Meridian events, hospitality, and a regional business magazine published an article titled Local Entrepreneur's Unusual Wedding Toast Goes Viral, and interviewed me about women in business and family dynamics and self-worth. And 6 months later, David and I hosted Thanksgiving at our new home that we had purchased with cash for $575,000. And both families were present, and the atmosphere was completely transformed from anything I had experienced before. And my mother asked me detailed questions about my plans to open a 6th venue in the neighboring county, and she took notes in a small notebook she had brought specifically for that purpose. And Amanda and I laughed together in the kitchen while preparing dessert, and she told me about her own dreams of maybe starting a side business and asked if I would mentor her. And I overheard my father say to David, I'm sorry we almost cost you this day. My daughter is remarkable. And David responded, She is. I'm glad you can see that now. And I stood there in my kitchen surrounded by family and felt something I had never felt before, which was the experience of being fully seen and celebrated for who I actually was. And I didn't need their approval to be successful, and I didn't need their validation to know my worth. But having them finally see me and really see me meant more than I had expected. Not because it made me more valuable, but because I got my family back on my terms this time, with boundaries I had established and maintained. And 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, I was at Meridian Grand overseeing another couple's wedding when I saw a nervous bride standing alone near the bridal suite looking worried, and I approached her and asked if she was okay, and she confided that her family was fighting over seating arrangements, and she was afraid they would ruin her day, and I pulled her aside and said, I promise you, no matter what happens, this day is yours. You've built something beautiful, and no one can take that from you. And I continued, Sometimes the people who should celebrate us the most have the hardest time seeing us clearly. But that says more about them than it does about you. And I told her, stand in your power, honor your worth, the right people will rise to meet you there. And she hugged me with tears streaming down her face and thanked me. And I watched her ceremony begin while holding David's hand. And I thought about my own journey and realized that I had tried to cancel myself for years to make my family comfortable, and they had tried to cancel my wedding to maintain their narrative about who I was. But I was uncancelable, and my worth was never up for debate, and neither was anyone else's. And after the ceremony, David and I slipped out to the garden as the sunset cast orange and pink light across Meridian Grand, and he asked, "Ready to go home, Mrs. Morrison?" And I looked at this venue I had built, and this business I had created, and this life I had constructed not for approval, but for joy, and I said, "More ready than I've ever been." And we left our empire behind for the night, knowing it would all be there tomorrow. Built on a foundation not of seeking validation, but of knowing my worth. And as we drove home, I felt a peace I had never experienced before. The peace of being fully myself without apology, and I knew that whatever came next, I would face it as someone who had learned the most important lesson of all, that the only approval I ever needed was my own.